Hello and welcome to a new chapter of Azure Support Academy number 24, How to Monitor a SQL Package Import Process. My name is José Manuel Jurado. I am a escalation engineer working in Microsoft and subject matter expert in this technology. As most probably you know, SQL Package tool has multiple options like export, import, and publish, for example. As we mentioned before, we are going to cover how to monitor a SQL package import process. Well, it's very important to remark that we need to know that a backpack file is not a native backup. Basically, it's a compressed file that contains the structure of the data of an exported database. So if you change the extension of the backpack file to zip, and you uncompress the file, you are going to see what are the details about schema, about the data, etc. In this case, like we need to import the data, it will be very easy to monitor the status because basically will be a bulk insert of all the files that we have in this backpack file, and we are going to create the tables, constraints, foreign keys of the database. Before going to this to the demo, how is the tools that we have, or how are the tools that we have in order to monitor the data or the process? Basically, you could run the SQL auditing, because as you know, SQL auditing is more or less a SQL profiler in SQLDB. You could add the diagnostic file when you run the SQL package, or you could use a PowerShell script that you could find out in this link that contains several DMVs, several queries that you could obtain what happened in your process. For example, how much is the resources that's sticking this process, what are the command that is running, etc. Other things that is very important is about the best practices. Well, for me it's very important to remark to use business critical or premium, because at the end this process will run a bulk insert, so we need as much we can a low latency on the storage. It's very important to review if you have enough space in your temporal folder to unzip the backpack, because basically when you run the SQL package will unzip the file in order to extract all the data. Also, other recommendation that I used to recommend, depending on the size of the backpack file and the speed that you need to have, or the one you want to have, is to use an SSD storage in the virtual machine. Also, two things that I think that it's obvious, but run the SQL package in a VM that is running the same region that the database is, and enable the accelerated networking in the VM, because we are going to transfer data to SQL Azure in this case. Okay, let's get started. So, in order to monitor this the SQL package import process, we develop a small PowerShell script that you could see in the screen, that we are going to run several DMVs in order to obtain some details about the execution. Basically, we are going to run in a loop. As you could see here, we are going to run 5 things. First is to know how many rows that we have per schema, how many objects that we have, etc. I'm going to explain what are the details about it. We are going to review the connections, how many connections that we have for from the SQL package, how many requests that we have, what is the status about these requests. We are going to run the resources in terms of I/O, CPU, etc. And finally, we are going to see how many constraints and indexes are disabled. Let me explain why we are review this one. Basically, as we mentioned before, when you run an import process, we are going to create the table, create the constraint, create the indexes. We are going to disable the indexes in order to speed up the load. And for the reason, we are going to review how many tables that we have with rows. Also, it's as we disable the indexes and foreign keys, once we have all the data imported, run the bulk inserts, we are going to rebuild the indexes or enable these indexes, and we are going to also re-enable all the constraints that are foreign keys. For the reason, this is the more or less is the information that we could see how is the process is running. So right now, I am running a process using the command that you can find out in the powers in this PPT. And the first thing that I'm going to run is, for example, is to obtain how many rows that we have per schema. Okay, we are going to see how many is the rows, how many we have the rows, etc. So I'm going to run right now. 1 second. Yeah. So as you could see here, we could see several details about the execution. So I'm going to stop here, and we are going to review what are the details that we could obtain. So, for example, this is the data per schema. So, right now, as you could see in the SQL Server, we could create some schemas. One way to know what are the process, how many tables that are finished, for example, or what is the process, is to collect the data per schema, how many tables that I have, how many tables are right now pending to be imported from SQL package, how many tables have been imported or has been processed by SQL package. For example, in this case, is 89% for the schema demo 1, demo 2, demo 3, etc. How many rows are importing right now? For example, we could see here, yeah, for example, we could see here right now is the number of rows that we have imported right now per schema. Also, we could see what is the increment that we have per executions. As we're running a cycle, we could see how many it's increasing time to time. Also, in terms of space, we could see how much is the space and comparing with the previous execution. Basically, we are running this in order to calculate what are the number of rows per, let's say, per every 5 seconds, etc. Other things that we could see is how many connections that we have. As you could see here, we have 10 processes running right now from this IP, from this login. Basically, in order to know how many processes that we have using SQL package, one thing that is very important is every time that you run a SQL package, you are going to see the program name DAGFX deploy. So if you run this query, you are going to see all the process, all the connection, for example, that we have basically for the SQL package. Other thing that is very important, it's about what are the requests, because in order to know if you have a contention in the process, one thing that I used to recommend is to run this small query that in order to obtain, for example, the session, the status, the wait type, the CPU time that is taking this process, the lapse time, and also the query. For the reason you could see here that we have 4 processes running at the same time. And right now the CPU is for example, is 563 milliseconds, but it's taking 1,300. It's running an insert bulk, most probably insert bulk for other tables. This is the wait type, etc. Other thing that I think that it's very important is to know if my database is enough or has enough resources in order to manage this workload. Because as I remember, we are going to insert the data, rebuild indexes, and enable the constraint. So for the reason, you could see here another query that basically is running the top 10, the top 10 of the query sorted by descending the first 10 rows about the execution in order to see how much CPUs we are using, how much data I/O, how much log I/O, memory, and workers. And finally, other things that I think that is very important is to know, because as we mentioned, once we finish the insert process, we are going to enable the indexes. So we are going to rebuild the indexes. That means that we need resources, space, etc. So right now all the indexes are disabled. So for the reason we have right now 89, sorry. And right now also the constraints that we have the foreign keys is right now all of them are disabled. So once the process, the SQL package import process finish this process, we are going to rebuild indexes and we are going to enable again the constraints. In this case, after this, we are going to see that the process finished. So as you can see, we are going to run this process again. You could see right now we have many processes running. Right now we have many processes depending on the database, etc. We have log manager flush, for example, PLH. So right now it's normal this wait stat, but because right now my database is not reaching the maximum of the log, of the transaction log, and we are not using the CPU. So right now, that means that my database has enough resources in order to import this data. Basically, this is the how the SQL Server package works when we are importing the data. Basically, as we mentioned, running insert bulk, etc. Okay, thank you so much for attending these sessions. If you have any questions, please send an email to gmjurado@microsoft.com.